What can we make of the leadership group that achieved victory during the Third Civil War and that sought to put an end to the Second Time of Troubles at the exact moment when new and colossal storms formed on the horizon? We saw that while Khrushchev, through tortured illusions, makes Kirov the victim of a plot organized by the Kremlin, Trotsky classifies him as an accomplice to the tyrant and a top-flight defender of the hated usurper and parasitical bureaucracy, which is to be swept away once and for all by the next revolution. But is the man assassinated by Nikolaev really a bureaucrat? Let's return to the Russian historian cited earlier, a critic of the myth of the assassination inspired by Stalin, to see how they describe the victim. So who is Kirov? He was a loyal leader, humble and devoted to the cause. And that's not all. What characterized him was his attention to the most minor of problems in the daily lives of his colleagues, a great modesty, tolerant of different opinions, and respectful toward cultures and traditions of other peoples. 437 This flattering judgment ends up putting Kirov's entire social group under a favorable light, and that ultimately puts Stalin in a favorable light, as the former was his intimate and trusted collaborator. This is absolutely not a bureaucratic elite without ideals, only interested in their careers. Quote, like many leaders of that era, Kirov genuinely believed in a bright future, for which he worked between 18 and 20 hours a day, a convinced communist, like when he sang Stalin's praises for strengthening the party in the Soviet Union, and for the country's power and development. This zealous faith was perhaps the tragedy of an entire generation. 438 unquote. In any case, it's the leadership group as a whole that demonstrates its work dedication and self-sacrifice. We previously learned of the enormous workload that the Soviet leader managed to take on. Quote, Stalin worked 14 or 15 hours a day in the Kremlin or at the dacha. In autumn of 1946, Stalin went to the south to enjoy a vacation for the first time since 1937. A few months before his death, and ignoring urgent recommendations from doctors, Stalin rejected the possibility of taking a break in the autumn or winter of 1952, despite the enormous amount of time and effort dedicated to organizing the 19th Party Congress in October. 439 unquote. A similar assessment can be made of one of Stalin's close collaborators, Lazarem Kaganovich, who displays frenzied commitment in overseeing the construction of the Moscow subway. He went right down into the tunnels, including at night, to check on the conditions of the workers and to get an idea of the situation. 440 To conclude, before us is a leadership group which demonstrates practically superhuman dedication. 441 Especially during the war years. It's a zealous faith that drives them. That faith isn't limited to that inner circle, nor is it limited to members of the Communist Party. Average men and women also demonstrated their missionary zeal. As a whole, it was a period of genuine enthusiasm, of feverish effort and voluntary sacrifice. 442 You can easily understand this spiritual climate if you have in mind that the country was blowing through stages of industrial development and offering great possibilities of upward mobility for much of the population, precisely at a time when the capitalist world was in the middle of a devastating crisis. Let's turn to another historian who makes use of an interesting memoir in his analysis. Quote, the years of 1928 to 1931 were a period of enormous upward mobility for the working class. The promoters of socialist emulation and Stakhanovites not only substituted unfit cadre, but occupied en masse the available posts in the administrative apparatus and in the learning institutions undergoing massive expansion. They were not passively promoted, but were active protagonists in their promotion. They had a clear and defined objective for the present and the future and sought to acquire the greatest amount of knowledge and practical experience, in order to be as useful as possible to the new society. Unquote. The Stakhanovite movement and socialist emulation played an important role in the process of industrialization. They helped the political leadership accelerate the speed of that process, promoting industrial modernization, reorganizing factory management under a unified model, and selecting young, ambitious, competent, and politically trustworthy workers for promotion. The emergence of these workers as a political force had an enthusiastic effect over party, industrial and union leaders. 443 An authoritative account confirms and deepens the image sketched out above. In 1932, in Riga, capital of Latvia, a young American diplomat, destined later to become famous as the advocate for Soviet containment, namely George Kennan, sends a cable to Washington which contains a very interesting analysis. First of all, he highlights that in the Soviet Union life continues being administered in the interest of a doctrine, that is, in the interest of communism. It's a worldview that can count on a wide consensus. The industrial proletariat enjoys high social recognition, so much so that according to him it largely compensates for material disadvantages related to the accelerated program of economic development. The youth, or a certain part of the youth, appear extremely enthusiastic and happy, as can only occur among human beings completely dedicated to tasks that have no relation to their personal lives. That's to say, people completely immersed in the inspiring project of building a new society. In this sense, one can speak of an unlimited self-confidence, and the happiness and mental health of the Russian youth. But then comes a warning that, in light of the subsequent historical experience, may be considered prescient. From the most morally united country in the world, Russia can overnight become the worst moral chaos. 444 Such a state of high moral tension could hardly withstand the passing of time, and the inevitable difficulties and failures in the project of building a new society. Thus the situation could easily turn against them. But it remains true that in 1932, before Kirov's assassination, Soviet Russia appears, in the eyes of the future advocate for containment, as the most morally united country in the world. Of course, here Kennan is more familiar with the reality in the cities, where, despite the contradictions, the changes had, in fact, aroused the enthusiasm of a large part of the youth, intellectuals, and industrial workers. 445 Than he is with the reality in the countryside. There the forced collectivization of agriculture had provoked, according to the far-sighted warning by Bukharin, a St. Bartholomew's night for the rich peasantry and, more generally, for an enormous number of peasants often belonging to national minorities. A civil war had broken out, and it had been carried out in such a ruthless and terrible way on both sides that it drives a Soviet military officer to suicide, disturbed by an inspection during which he had repeatedly exclaimed that it wasn't communism but horror. 446 It was probably that horror that provoked Bukharin's moral crisis, outraged by the large-scale St. Bartholomew's Night, against which he had warned in vain, and horrified by the colossal experiment in social engineering that continued on without mercy, without distinguishing between a person and a scrap of wood. 447 And after the conclusion of collectivization, it's not convincing to speak of the countryside as morally united, as if the memory of the civil war that fractured and bloodied it had totally disappeared. However, despite these necessary clarifications, Kennan's insistence on the enthusiasm and the commitment to doctrine reminds us of the earlier references to zealous faith and missionary zeal. Even with the outbreak of the Great Terror in 1937, the situation doesn't change substantially, at least according to similar analysis by an American and a Russian historian. The first, while insisting on the manipulation of public opinion from above, nonetheless observes that Stalin in 1935 enjoyed great popularity. An eventual attempt to overthrow him would have faced wide resistance. 448 With regard to the following year, the second historian indicates that the party and the Soviet people remain confident in Stalin. Moreover, as a consequence of the fact that urban and rural standards of living have improved considerably, A certain measure of popular enthusiasm became widespread. 449 It's not just rising living standards motivating such enthusiasm. There's more, the genuine development of nations until that moment marginalized, the conquest on the part of women of legal equality with men, along with an improvement in their social status, the emergence of a solid social welfare system which includes pensions, medical assistance, protections for pregnant women, family pensions, the significant development of education and the intellectual sphere as a whole, with the expansion of the network of libraries and reading rooms and the increasing love for the arts and poetry. It's the chaotic and exhilarating arrival of modernity. 450 It has to do with processes that characterize the entire history of Soviet Russia, but that take off precisely during the Stalin years. The popular masses traditionally condemned to illiteracy burst into the schools and universities. They then become a whole new generation of skilled workers, technicians, and expertly trained administrators, quickly called upon to carry out a leadership role. New cities are founded and old cities are rebuilt. The opening of new and colossal industrial complexes goes hand in hand with the upward mobility of skilled and ambitious citizens of working class or peasant origin. 451 Ultimately, it's referred to as a mixture of brutal coercion, remarkable heroism, disastrous madness, and spectacular achievements. 452 Maybe it's not even these results, and the consequent economic improvements, that constitute the principal aspect of the radical social transformation of the workplace during the transition from the old regime to the new regime. Workers demanded more respectful treatment by their employers. They wanted them to call them by the polite you instead of the familiar one, which they associated with the old serf regime. They wanted to be treated as citizens. It was often this issue of respectful treatment, rather than the bread-and-butter question of wages, which fueled workers' strikes and demonstrations. 453 Long having sought after it in vain, the serfs obtained their recognition with the arrival of Soviet power. And this is true not just for the workers, but for national minorities as well, as we shall see. It is this combination of spectacular achievements in economic development and the toppling of the old regime's hierarchies which encourages a sense of exaltation among the people. On top of the recognition achieved by workers is the recognition achieved by the Soviet people as a whole, a Soviet people now at the point of catching up with the most developed countries, ridding themselves of the traditional image of backwardness. This explains the feeling of exhilaration in participating in the construction of a new society and a new civilization, which advances despite the mistakes, sacrifices, and terror. Moreover, it's interesting to reread the principal accusation made against the Soviet bureaucracy's leadership, formulated by Trotsky before the Great Terror. It's as if suddenly the indictment gives way to acknowledgments that are so important that they turn the indictment on its head. Gigantic achievements in industry, enormously promising beginnings in agriculture, an extraordinary growth of the old industrial cities and the building of new ones, a rapid increase in the numbers of workers, a rise in cultural level and cultural demands. Such are the indubitable results of the October Revolution, in which the prophets of the old world tried to see the grave of human civilization. With the bourgeois economists we have no longer anything to quarrel over. Socialism has demonstrated its right to victory, not on the pages of Das Kapital, but in an industrial arena comprising a sixth part of the Earth's surface. Thanks solely to a proletarian revolution a backward country has achieved in less than 20 years successes unexampled in history. 454 With economic development, not only new social strata but entire nations gain access to culture. In the schools of the Union, lessons are taught at present in no less than 80 languages. For a majority of them, it was necessary to compose new alphabets, or to replace the extremely aristocratic Asiatic alphabets with the more democratic Latin. Newspapers are published in the same number of languages, papers which for the first time acquaint the peasants and nomadic shepherds with the elementary ideas of human culture. Within the far-flung boundaries of the Tsar's empire, a native industry is arising. The old semi-clan culture is being destroyed by the tractor. Together with literacy, scientific agriculture and medicine are coming into existence. It would be difficult to overestimate the significance of this work of raising up new human strata. 455 In regards to the relationship with backwards nationalities, the hated bureaucracy in spite of everything carries out a progressive work. It is laying down a bridge for them to the elementary benefits of bourgeois and even pre-bourgeois culture. 456 Based on this image, it remains a mystery how Trotsky could have thought the anti-bureaucratic revolution was just around the corner. But this is not of interest to us now. The acknowledgments, let slip by the opposition leader, are an indication of the prestige and consensus which the Soviet leadership still enjoyed. The spread of a new Soviet patriotism can't be explained in any other way. It's a sentiment that's certainly very deep, sincere, and dynamic. 457, 1937 and 1938 are the biennium of the Great Terror. Not even in its worst phase does Stalin's regime lose its base of social consensus and its enthusiastic supporters, who continue to be motivated by both ideology as well as the opportunity for social advancement. It's a mistake to read this permanent consensus as merely an artifice of state censorship and repression. 458 A tragic and paradoxical interaction takes place, as a consequence of robust economic and cultural development, as well as the horrifying vacancies created by repression. Tens of thousands of Stakhanovites become factory managers, and a similar upward mobility takes place in the armed forces. 459 In August of 1939, during the negotiations over the Non-Aggression Pact, the chief translator of the German Foreign Ministry visits Moscow and describes as follows the spectacle before him in Red Square and at the mausoleum dedicated to Lenin. Quote, before the mausoleum, a long line of Russian peasants waited patiently to see Stalin's mummified predecessor in his glass tomb. Judging by their behavior and facial expression, the Russians gave me the impression of devout pilgrims. Those who have been to Moscow and haven't visited Lenin, an embassy staffer tells me, are worthless to the people of the Russian countryside. 460 The generalized veneration of Stalin's predecessor was also an indication of the wide base of social consensus that the successor continued to enjoy. In any case, the deep divisions caused by the Great Terror are at least partially healed by the patriotic unity that takes hold during the resistance against the Nazi war of enslavement and annihilation. What's certain is, and we cite once more a historian above suspicion of being an apologist for communism and Stalinism, the victory brings about an unparalleled increase not only in the international prestige of the Soviet Union, but also in the regime's authority within the country, so that Stalin's popularity reached its apex in the years following the war. 461 This popularity remained intact until his death, and was also felt outside the USSR, and to a certain extent, even felt outside the international communist movement.